So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Keep It Clean Product Advisory webinar. I'm Heidi Dancho. I'm the Director of Communications for the Canola Council of Canada here in Winnipeg. So we have a lot to cover this morning, so we'll get started. If you're not already familiar with Keep It Clean, this is a joint initiative of the Canola Council of Canada, Pulse Canada, Cereals Canada, Bartley Council of Canada, and the Prairie Oak Growers Association. So the program focuses on providing growers and advisors with resources for growing crops that meet the requirements of our domestic and our export customers. So as an export-driven industry, the success of Canadian agriculture depends on steady and predictable access to major international markets. And our crop protection product application decisions are an important part of that, which is why we're all here today. Next slide, please. So we have 4 panelists with us today to provide timely information about which crop protection products may create market risk in 2021 and provide some more information on how these classifications are made. So I just wanted to welcome our panelists today. We have Gord Kurbis, Vice President of Trade Policy for Crop Protection at the Canada Grains Council. Gord will be providing an overview of the Canada Grains Council's market acceptance of pesticide use policy, including how markets of interest, pesticides of interest, and risk is determined. Then we have Victoria Linden, who's the Director of Research at Cereals Canada, and she'll provide an overview of the 2021 product advisory and updates for cereals. We'll have Greg Bartley, who's the Director of Crop Protection and Crop Quality at Pulse Canada, who will cover product advisory updates for pulse crops, and Ian Epp, who's an agronomy specialist at the Canola Council of Canada, who will provide an update for canola, along with some important tips on following the label when applying crop protection products this season. So Gord, I will turn things over to you.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, right? Okay. All right, next slide, please. All right, so my job here is to describe what we have this for and how does it work. Next slide, please. So you're going to hear from the National Commodity Associations today, Canola, Pulse, and Cereals, about the actual advisories for what to use and what not to use for 2021. And I thought I would jump on this webinar to give some perspective on, why are we talking about this now, just in the last couple of years? Because this is pretty new stuff, yet pesticides and trade risk have been around for a long time. And I want to give you some insights as to how these recommendations get developed. And because one day there's going to be probably a close call that you'll be looking at and you'll be thinking, you know what, I'm not totally sure I agree with this, but I would like to know, is someone just making the stuff up on the fly? Or is there a real recipe book that is laid out and predictable? The answer is yes, there is. Next slide, please. So this is all about market access. Nobody needs to be reminded about how export dependent we are as Canada. We're probably going into what most people who work in this space agree is a more uncertain area in terms of international trade. We're seeing more trade liberalization with more trade agreements, but as that happens, we're seeing more weird non-tariff barriers come up, which can be like playing a game of whack-a-mole. We don't want pesticide residues to become part of that. So in a lot of ways, this is a proactive thing. And I just want to draw to your attention, let's all think about how many times we're reading about pesticides in non-farm newspapers. We saw all these glyphosate lawsuits come out of California in the last couple of years, and not too long after that, we were seeing our trading partners come up with non-science-based pesticide policies, propose bans on glyphosate. We'd seen those in probably 3 or 4 countries, Thailand, Vietnam, and it's probably on Europe's radar screen as well. So that's why we're talking about this now and not maybe 5 or 10 years ago, although we were partially then too. And the group that came up with this, as the Canada Grains Council, all we did was write the owner's manual and build the piece of equipment, and then it's up to Greg and Victoria and Ian and their teams to operate the equipment. So who wrote that owner's manual? It was a group consisting of 5 parts of the value chain. We had grower associations, national commodity associations, grain companies, life science companies, and we also had members from the Canadian Association of Agri-Retailers. And it's a voluntary policy. So now I'm going to go through it a little quicker. Next slide, please. There's 3 parts of the thing. All we're doing is saying, Canadian grain, oilseed, and pulse exports, I'm going to just say it's a Canadian grain. It's in 100 countries easy around the world. If we waited for every single one of those countries that we export to have an MRL in place, we would have no pesticides that we could use in Canada. So it's all about balancing trade risk and making sure that on the other side of the coin, everyone has access to the latest innovation. And we want to find that spot that's right in the middle of the bullseye that balances those things. So number 1 is, what countries do we need to worry about? We've got a recipe book for that. It's not easy or simple, but we have to have one, so we do, and I'll show you it. Next, what are the pesticides that could be a trade problem? Some pesticides have no residues, seed treatments. Others, you'll have no detectable residues because it's grain and it's used on such limited acres. By the time you get to export position, you'll never find it. And then 3, for the ones that we do need to take a closer look at, how do we define how close a call it is before we start to worry? And then if it gets in our crosshairs as, the people who sit on these committees and make these calls, is it going to be red light, green light, or yellow light? Green light is, yeah, this one's fine. Red light is do not use. That doesn't happen very often. And the yellow one is, well, this one, there's more to it than meets the eye, so we want you to go and talk to your grain buyer. Next slide, please. Okay. Don't expect you to read all this, just wanted to show it as a screenshot. This is the recipe book for coming up with the markets of interest. In the end, usually we come up with a list that's fewer than 10, but that includes codex, and when you have a codex MRL, that covers a lot of ground internationally because many countries use it. Next one, please. In terms of the pesticides of interest, there's a decision tree that's also similarly defined. You start with everything that you've got registered on the crops or that maybe you looked at last year. You just need to do an update. Hey, did the conclusions we reach, do we need to re-examine it in any way because the use pattern changed or what have you? Again, the principle here is some don't have any residues in practical terms because they just don't, or the data package shows they're super low, or it's going to be on super limited acres. Then whatever falls out of that, that's not true for, then that gets looked at way more closely. Next one, please. In the end, that triggers, we go to the life science company and say, what's the detailed data look like? Because all this stuff has to be subject to trials in order for Health Canada, Pest Management Regulatory Agency, to even register the stuff. So there's always data. The committee will take a look at some of the basic parameters around that, and that will usually guide the decision, but not always. There could be other criteria that are sort of color commentary that influence whether that's red, green, or yellow. Next one, please. So, and I just want to leave you with this last thought, and then we'll pass the baton over to Victoria. But when Victoria and Ian and Greg and their committees are operating the machinery, what happens if it's such a close call that not everyone can agree on red versus yellow versus green? And I just want to let you know there's also a very defined decision tree for that. If it's not clear, then it goes to quite a detailed calculation on how much blending is expected to make the residues decrease by the time that the grain gets into exportable position, such that we're nice and tight and we're not going to run into problems with the most restrictive MRLs. If that consensus can't be reached, it goes to a defined qualified majority. If that can't be reached, then it goes to that larger committee of the 5 segments to see if they can come up with a qualified majority. And if they can't agree, then it goes one step higher to the Canada Grains Council board. So I hope I've just left you with this stuff is not being made up on the fly. And with that, take it away, Victoria. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Greg. Gord, sorry. So the process that Gord just outlined, we as cereals, pulse, and canola have gone through this exercise with the entire value chain to look at what products should be included in the 2021 product advisory. So this is a snapshot of what the 2021 Keep It Clean product advisory looks like. You can find it on the Keep It Clean website and in the resource tab. So the next several minutes, each commodity will be going through each of the chemistries that's included on this year's advisory. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick it off starting about the 2021 product advisory for cereals. Next slide, please. So there's no change this year in terms of pre-harvest glyphosate. This is the same as it's been for the last several years. So we have a red or do not use classification for malt barley, and that's because pre-harvest glyphosate can have some effects on the germination through the malting process. So it's not accepted for use on malt barley. For oats, wheat, and food and feed barley, there are some grain companies that aren't accepting pre-harvest treated grains with glyphosate. So it'll be really important as producers to check with your grain buyer and as extension specialists and agronomists to make sure that you're aware that that there may be situations where it's not accepted. So you should really go into the situation informed. Ian's going to be talking a bit about pre-harvest glyphosate use coming up in a few minutes, so I'm not going to spend much more time on that. Next slide, please. The next product on the advisory for cereals, also under the pre-harvest weed control category, is saflufenicil or heat. So this is another product that's not permitted for use on malt barley due to the negative effects that it can have on the malting process, but it is acceptable for wheat and food and feed barley. Next slide, please. And the last product on the cereals product advisory for 2021 is chlormequat, or trade name manipulator. So this product is categorized as amber for malt barley. There are many grain buyers that aren't accepting chlormequat treated malt barley, but there is at least one. So it'll be really important for producers and advisors alike to understand this yellow classification for chlormequat on malt barley. Make sure, first and foremost, that you as a grower or you as an advisor are advising to make sure that any contract obligations are being followed. And then if you're growing a crop of barley that you're trying to get to spec at the end of the season for malt barley, check with who you're planning to sell to make sure that either it's accepted or not, and then act accordingly. For oats, wheat, and barley, food and feed barley rather, chlormequat is rated as green, so you're good to go there. So this leads me into talking about the first of the 5 simple tips of the Keep It Clean program of using acceptable pesticides only. So the bottom line is, make sure that you're having an open conversation with your grain buyer so that you know what's accepted and what's not accepted on the crop, so that you don't have any issues marketing your crop at the end of the season. So that's it from Cereals Canada, and I'm going to pass it over to Greg to speak about the Pulse product advisory.
Great, thanks, Victoria. So yeah, my name is Greg Bartley. I'm the Director of Crop Protection and Crop Quality here at Pulse Canada, and I'll quickly run through the Pulse classifications for the 2021 growing season. So the first one I want to touch on is a new addition to the advisory this year. It's not great bringing new products to the advisory. We want to make sure that growers have access to crop protection products, but it's important to identify when MRL changes are happening in the market. So the first one I want to talk about is the fungicide chlorothalonil. And as you can see, we're classifying it as a yellow for chickpeas. So for peas and lentils, it's a green. You're free to use the product. There's no restrictions there. But for yellow, we're providing a bit of a caution. Now, the reason why we've made this yellow classification is that the European Union is going to be dropping the MRLs down to a default level later in the growing season. So as you can see, they're going from one part per million down to 0.01 parts per million. Really low compared to the MRLs that are established here in Canada and in some of our other markets. Now, as you can see, the peas and lentil MRLs were at the default level here in Canada at 0.1. Just providing that indication that, we really don't see detectable residues of this product on these crops. However, for chickpeas, you can see a much higher MRL established in Canada. That high MRL of 7 parts per million is not an indication of the actual residues that we're expecting to find on chickpeas. However, we do believe that there is some potential that residues may be above that 0.01 parts per million default in the European Union. So what we're providing here is giving a caution. Talk to your buyer before using this product. If the buyer is sending a lot of chickpeas to the European Union, especially knowing that chickpeas do go in container shipments, so we do see a bit more risk when you're going in these small lot shipments. There's less blending that occurs, greater potential for, if there is an exceedance, it may show up in a container versus a bulk shipment. So really go have that conversation with the buyer, see if they have any concerns with this, and hopefully you'll still be able to use this product, although there just may be a bit more sensitivity towards it. I do want to mention here that we're still trying to gather further information to really get a handle on what may be expected as far as residues in this new low MRL in the EU. So Pulse Canada will continue to monitor this active ingredient during this growing season and see if we can get a better recommendation for next year as far as what this level of risk means and maybe a bit more guidance to growers in the future. The second active ingredient I want to talk about has been on advisory in the past. This is pre-harvest glyphosate. So as you can tell, pre-harvest glyphosate is classified as that yellow be informed for all pulse crops. Now, the classification is due to a mixture of things. One thing we've done that's different for this year is add a bit more clarity through the addition of an MA notation. So it's really standing for market acceptance notation. What we're trying to accomplish here is bring clarity to when some of these classifications are made strictly due to missing or misaligned MRLs. So as you can see for chickpeas, dry beans, and fava beans, we do have some missing or misaligned MRLs for these three crops. For chickpeas and fava beans, we do not have a Codex MRL, and this poses a risk. I do want to mention that we're hopeful that Codex MRL will be resolved this growing season, but until it's in place, we'll still communicate this potential risk. And for dry beans, we do have some misalignment with lower MRLs compared to Canadian MRLs. If you look at peas and lentils, we're actually in a fairly good place, in a really good place actually for our MRLs in our export markets where they're either aligned or established at higher levels in Canada. This is really good indication or really good scenario to be in. However, we're still communicating that there's potential market risks due to the market acceptance of the product. We continually hear from our grain buyers that there's continuous scrutiny of pre-harvest glyphosate in the global marketplace, and there may be restrictions from some buyers where they're trying to meet that demand, or I guess meet the need for pre-harvest glyphosate or low residue crops. So it's really a be informed. Talk to your buyer, have an open conversation ahead of pre-harvest glyphosate use to see if that product will be accepted, and make sure that you're well known of the risks before applying the product. The final product that appears on advisory is glufosinate ammonium. And the first thing I want to do is highlight the product registration differences between Eastern and Western Canada. So as you can tell, in Western Canada, there is a registration for glufosinate use as a desiccant on lentils. If you look to Eastern Canada, there is a registration for desiccation use on dry beans, and then it's not registered on any other crops. So for Western Canada, we are continuing the classification of a red do not use on lentils due to missing and misaligned MRLs. As you can see in the chart, we've established MRL of 6 parts per million here in Canada, but we do not have MRLs established at Codex or the US, and the levels are established at a default level in the European Union at 0.03 parts per million. This is a major risk. We really highly recommend growers not to use this product on lentils. And I do want to highlight that this registration is for some generic uses of glyphosate. So your Liberty branded products are not registered for use on lentils, desiccation use on lentils as it is as well. If you look to Eastern Canada, we're providing a yellow classification. This is a be informed, talk to your buyer beforehand. When you look at the MRL scenario, it's really not much better when you look compared to the lentils. However, I just want to highlight the Japan MRL of 2 parts per million. And the reason why it's remained a yellow is there's an important use pattern for dry bean growers for certain market classes that are beans going into Japan. Due to the nature of the dry bean industry and a lot of the acres under production contracts, it's much easier to get a handle on glyphosate use and make sure beans that are going into sensitive markets will not have that product applied. But if it's going into Japan, buyers are willing to allow that use to continue. So it's why we have that yellow classification for dry beans. The final update I want to provide is really just an update is related to dicot. So this is some good news for growers. Last fall, the US established a long-awaited import tolerance for dicot on pulse crops that is harmonized with Canadian MRLs. So this is a long-standing issue that we've had in misalignment with the US previously having low MRLs for pulse crops. Now that these MRLs have been harmonized and the US has established import tolerance, we no longer have MRL concerns in our export markets. So dicot has been removed from the 2020 product advisory and just appears as an update saying that these MRL issues have been resolved. So hopefully into the future, you will not see this active ingredient on the product advisory into the future. And from here, I'll pass it over to Ian from the Canola Council to touch on some canola products.
Thanks, Greg. So like Greg said, I'm an agronomy specialist at the Canola Council of Canada, and I'm also leading our market access committee. So the product advisory for canola is one of good news this year. We have no market concerns for products registered for use in canola. So we do not have a product on our advisory for this year. That's actually the same as last year. For those of you that have been following the Keep It Clean program for a number of years, we have had products such as metconazole or quinclorac appear on the list, but they are good to go. Next slide. So while we don't have any products on our advisory, it is really important. We still can have market access issues pop up with products that are registered and that have an MRL in place if they're not used properly. So our tip number 2 for Keep It Clean is read and follow that label. I know those labels every product has a long, lengthy label. We have use patterns we're used to using, but there's situations that can arise on specific years, cases where things don't go quite to plan, and now we start to push to the edges of those labels, and maybe we have an off-label application. And so even though a product doesn't appear on our advisory, if we do have an off-label application, that can cause residue issues. So we're talking about rates, making sure we're using the actual registered rate for the product and for that specific crop. The timing, again, that window of timing is really important, especially some of the later season and certain products. Certain products do have residues, and we've accounted for that with international MRLs if they're applied at the right rate and the right timing. But should we exceed one of those, suddenly we have residues that are no longer acceptable and we can have problems. And then again, that pre-harvest interval, that period of time between when we apply the product and when we're going to harvest the crop. Next slide. So timing, you've already heard a little bit about glyphosate. Pre-harvest weed seed control, we're talking about less than 30% moisture in the least mature areas of the field. And again, I think that's the important part to stress. That's what makes this is a long-standing timing. This hasn't changed, but that least mature area of the field. Again, depending on how the growing season goes, some fields we have highly variable fields where we have areas that well past 30%, way farther dried down, and areas that are still grass green. So making sure we're applying it when that 30% moisture is the least mature areas of the fields. And this applies for any commodity. Again, doesn't matter. Canola specifically, it's, we're looking at 50–60% color change in those areas, but any crop, we need to look at those greenest areas and either wait for those areas or maybe not apply, maybe cut them a little bit separately. Again, this causes issues, but variable fields make this a lot more difficult. And if you need a staging guide, a quick staging guide, Keep It Clean has a great guide for that. Next slide. So the pre-harvest interval, so that's the time when you apply the product all the way up to harvest. You know, maybe we're not always that familiar with them. They're fairly straightforward. It's keep in mind that there's a lot of variance between them. Some of them have 0 PHI. You can spray something today, harvest it tomorrow. Some of them are up to 60 days. So again, with our early season herbicides, generally this doesn't cause a problem. The on-label window of application is well earlier than whatever PHI is, but especially as we get into these pre-harvest products, and then the ones that kind of come up every couple of years. So if we have a late season grasshopper outbreak, or maybe it's a diamondback moth, something that happens late, and maybe growers, we don't apply these products regularly. Insecticides, there's quite a bit of a difference. So there might, for a late grasshopper application, there might be 2 or 3 products that are registered for grasshoppers, but the PHA might be quite a bit different. So depending on how close you are to harvest, one product might be way more suitable for that application. And with that, especially in the canola world, depending whether we're swathing that crop or we're straight cutting it, some growers decide to make that decision a little bit closer to harvest, depending what the crop's looking like, what the conditions are. Again, that might factor into what insecticide or what product actually fits and what that pre-harvest interval is going to look like. So if you're interested what your PHI is, this spray to swath calculator at the Keep It Clean website, it has all of the products, their various pre-harvest intervals. So it's a quick, easy place to compare 2 or 3 different products if that helps you make a pesticide decision. Next slide. So that's kind of it for canola. Good news, but just keep in mind that as we hit the growing season, that staying on the label is really, really critical.
Great. Thanks, Ian, and thanks to all of our panelists. We have some time allocated now for any questions from our participants here today. So again, if you have any questions, please type them into that questions panel that you'll see on the webinar, on the right side of your webinar screen. There has been a few questions here. Let me just take a look. Okay, so someone here just wants to confirm metconazole is okay for canola. So Ian, if you could speak to that.
Yes, metconazole, it has been on our product advisory in the past, but it is, for this growing season, it is good to use as per the label.
Great, thank you. I had another question here. Gord, I think I'll direct this one to you. How many importing countries use 0 tolerance?
Yeah, good. That's actually a good question. The answer is just about everybody. So one of the problems here, and one of the reasons we're all on this webinar talking about this stuff, is because we don't really have a very good international system that governments take the same approaches on how they regulate pesticides and MRLs and all that. And that's a whole thing that various people in the value chain who work on trade are out there trying to fix. But until that gets fixed, just about every country that we export to has a policy that says, look, if we don't have an MRL in place, then we're going to apply the principle of 0 tolerance. And for just about every country in the world, that takes the form of 0.01 parts per million. So it's a problem. And that's, if we didn't have the principle of 0 tolerance, we probably wouldn't be talking about this stuff today. That's not entirely, but as a rough rounding, that's probably correct.
Great, thank you, Gord. Another question came in here. If I understood the comment correctly regarding glyphosate, ammonium, and that Liberty brands are not registered for pre-harvest use, in practical purposes, can the industry actually detect which brand is used? I'm not sure if that was Greg, if you wanted to take that, or Victoria. Yeah.
Yep, I can try that. So yeah, no, it's important. It gets back to that follow the label. You know, if a crop is not on the product label, you know, you cannot use that product. Whether the industry can tell or not, there may be differences in formulations and things like that. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what those differences are, but you know, there's potential for that. So it's really important to make sure the product you're using is actually registered on that crop, as there may be some differences there. So.
Great, thank you, Greg. Ian, can I find that PHI calculator in the App Store or Google Play Store?
I think it's just on the Keep It Clean website. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's bookmarked on my browser. That's where I go find it all the time. Yeah, the Keep It Clean website, it's fairly easy to find in there. You can bookmark it and save it on your phone for quick access while you're out in the sprayer, if that's helpful as well.
Yeah, it is available. Keepitclean.ca is the website to find that on. Here. Oh, you show it on a mobile device was the other comment. Yeah, it is mobile friendly. It's not an app, but you can use it on your phone. Okay, yeah. Any other questions? Please enter them in. We have some time left to answer any other questions. One other question I got in here, is it a food safety problem if an MRL is exceeded? Gord, maybe I'll turn that one over to you.
Trying to think how to answer this. It would be, my mind goes between either never or virtually never. That's in the world that we live in, with application, growing the kind of crops we do, and it being grain. I work closely with some international people on this kind of stuff, and I know a New Zealand regulator who's been monitoring the stuff for 32 years, and he says in his entire career he saw one case that was a close call. So really what we're talking about here is just meeting import requirements. So one of the reasons we don't have a very good international system is because we're starting off actually with, what some people might call the wrong premise. And MRL sounds a lot like this is the tolerance for food safety, and if you go above it, you've got a food safety problem, and that's not at all true. An MRL is set by definition on the basis of, if this product is applied as per the label, what does the middle of the bullseye look like in terms of the expected levels of residue? Then when you equate that to food safety, you're saying, well, there might be 30 or 40 crops I eat in a typical day and little sprinkles on all sorts of processed products or things that I cook. The food safety equation comes in when you say, when you add up all those sources of residues, then you compare that to what the regulators see as a risk cup, and could any one of those residues create a food safety problem? So it's a bit of a complicated thing, and it's a mess, and it's frequently misinterpreted, but the answer is no. This is not a food safety issue.
Great, thank you, Gord. Another question here around PHIs. I had an experience where PHIs of a particular insecticide active ranged from 3 days to 21 days, depending on which generic I was using. In this case, I couldn't get the low PHI product, but had less than 21 days before harvest. What's the deal with varying PHIs on virtually the same products? Ian, would you be able to speak to that?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I think, as you heard from Greg, we have to follow the label. It is what it is. So if you are applying a product, you have to follow what the PHI is specifically. Now, why there would be a difference in PHI between the similar products, it might be a difference in registration. It could be a difference in formulation. Sometimes we do get differences in formulation that might mean it persists, or how it interacts, how it breaks down in the environment is slightly different without knowing which insecticide. So that's potentially a case. Labels are sometimes updated or tweaked. It could be a change in the label, or depending if there's one active in this or two. There's a few different ways. Unfortunately, if you have the product that has a PHI of 21 days, that is what is required to follow.
Great, thanks, Ian. Just a comment and maybe question, but if we could describe some of the potential implications when a commodity shipment is detected with more than acceptable limits. I don't know if there's a volunteer to speak to that one here on our team.
Sure, I can handle that. The potential implications is non-compliance. So if a product is tested and it's found to exceed an MRL, that shipment may be rejected, and that comes at a cost. You know, the company either has to send that cargo back, or it gets rerouted to another country where it's more acceptable, or it's potentially destroyed. So it's a scenario that no one wants to go through, and that's just a potential cost to the grain buyer that's selling it. There's also a reputation cost that comes along to it as well that has further implications. As soon as you get an MRL non-compliance, that can increase testing of other products, and it spirals from there. So the best case scenario is really to avoid that scenario, and you know that's why we're doing this program is to try to mitigate that risk ahead of time, just to avoid that situation. It doesn't benefit anyone to have these non-compliances.
Great, thanks, Greg. Gord, another question for you. Could you review again what the key countries are that we're considering with the advisory? And are we confident that those countries will trust Canada's suggestions considering traditional zero tolerance policies?
Yeah, so it's going to differ just because, okay, so the table stakes countries that you need to have an MRL in are Japan, Europe, US, and Codex. And then there's another category that we call, for lack of a better term, who's going to be the next Japan or the next Europe, where they're very sensitive and they've got quite sophisticated monitoring programs and so on. And so South Korea is also on that list. And then we also have a markets in transition. So are there countries that formerly didn't have a codified system that are moving towards one? China's on that list now. And then each of Victoria and Greg and Ian are all going to have different, who is our absolute big market or a couple of big markets that don't fall into anything that I've named already, but that might be wheat specific. So maybe, Indonesia gets caught up in that for Victoria, and it might be different for Greg and Ian. And so that's sort of the basket of how that list of markets works. And then the question is, do each of those markets have a defined zero tolerance policy in place if they don't technically have an MRL? And the answer is not every single one of those would. For example, Japan and Europe sure would. I mean, these are rules-based economies, but once in a while, there will be a country in there that would be, sort of a non-rules-based country that is more informally governed. And then it's up to the judgment of the committee about how are you going to interpret it?
Great, thanks, Gord. Got a few more questions coming in. Is there an app developed for all crops and applicable chemicals? I would say, I'm not sure if that was referring to the spray to swath, but currently the spray to swath calculator is covering pulse and canola, if that answers your question. And if not, just feel free to submit another question into our question here.
Yeah, I can add on to that, Heidi.
Sure.
So yeah, all of these resources are available on the Keep It Clean website. The suggestion of an app is a great one, and one that we can take into consideration for upcoming season. So thanks for that.
Another question here came in. Who do we talk to in regards to MRLs for specific crops? I am thinking mustard in particular.
Sure. So for mustard in particular, Pulse Canada also represents the Canadian Special Crops Association, which mustard would fall under. So this goes for anyone. If you have any MRL questions for any crops, direct it to the contacts such as myself, Victoria, Ian, at our respective organizations, and we are happy to provide any MRL information regarding the crops and export markets. It's something that we can easily look up and provide that information.
Yeah, and almost a related question here is, how do we find out if there is an MRL for a product in a crop? Greg, if you wanted to speak to that.
For sure. It's the easiest way, I think, is just to reach out and ask. if a product is registered, it will have an MRL. So that the challenge is, do the export markets have an MRL? And this is where we've done the hard work for everyone. If you see it on our product advisory, we're highlighting those potential risks. If you don't see it on the advisory, chances are it's not a concern, or it's not a major concern. I'm not saying that there isn't potential risk. It's just that it hasn't made that major type scenario where we're trying to communicate to the industry. So again, any of these MRL questions, definitely reach out to our organizations. We're happy to provide that information. But I think the takeaway is, if it's on the product advisory, just pay attention to what we're trying to communicate within that advisory.
Great, thank you. Another question here is, I don't recall any instances of shipments being rejected for a while. Any idea when this last happened? I'm not sure if, Greg, you might even have some insight there.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, that's the thing is people don't like to publicly announce and indicate when we got some non-compliances. I'd say my only comment is that it happens. It does still happen. It may not be a major, and you might not hear about it, but it's definitely something that we really need to pay attention to. There's also differences in the types of non-compliances as well. There may be a regulatory non-compliance where it's caught up when the regulatory agency, when the importing country catches it. But there's also commercial non-compliances. A lot of the companies that are bringing in product are doing their own testing, and that has implications as well. So just because you don't hear about it doesn't mean it's not happening, although the industry is doing everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen. So no news is good news. We like to strive to that zero, and we'll continue to not hear about this.
Hey, Heidi, can I add my 2 cents into that too?
Yeah, of course.
People who want to know about this more, Google MRLs and the US International Trade Commission. They've just come out with the kind of reports that we haven't seen before, that go through very detailed case studies about crops that have gotten in real trouble, not in Canada, but around the world, on MRLs. And most of the time people don't want to talk about that kind of thing, because if this winds up, people could start to equate my crop is some sort of tree nut, and there's some examples, and now I've got pesticides, and this is in headlines, so maybe the consumers associate my particular crop with pesticide residue problems. So there's a sensitivity around that, and a lot of the time you don't get to see a public report like the one I'm just describing. So if you Google MRLs and US International Trade Commission, you're going to see lots of examples. And I would suggest that in the Canadian grain industry, this is more of a proactive move that's trying to prevent us from getting into that territory than this is, hey, we got in trouble once or 10 times, and now we're trying to fix up our act. It's about where we don't want to wind up, because we can see lots of examples of that.
Great, thanks, Gord. Okay, I think that pretty well wraps up our questions. I'm happy we were able to get through all of them right on time here, so that's great. So on behalf of Keep It Clean, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining today's event. If you have any other questions, reach out to us. Our email address is info@keepitclean.ca, or you can reach out to us directly as well. And once again, we will be posting a recording of this webinar on the website. I also just wanted to share that we do plan to do another Keep It Clean webinar. I hope you guys found this one helpful. We'll be doing another one later this summer focused on pre-harvest glyphosate application timing. So I hope everyone here is able to kind of stay tuned, and we will share more information on that one, on our website, on email, as soon as we have that registration ready to go. So thanks again for joining us today, and hope everyone has a great afternoon.